Thank you all for coming. My clock just turned to 10 o'clock, so we are going to go ahead and get started. So again, thank you guys for joining me to learn about common trees of Pinellas. I could make this probably an all-day presentation, so I'm going to do my best to keep it within an hour. I will give you a little stretch break halfway through, because if you're anything like me, I can't stare at a screen forever. And we are doing this in honor of Florida Arbor Day. So National Arbor Day takes place in April, but we're special because we don't get snow. And so we celebrate Arbor Day early in January. It's always the third Friday in January. And so we thought this would be an appropriate presentation to do for that. And for those of you that don't know me, my name is Lara Milligan. I am the Natural Resources Agent for UF IFAS Extension here in Pinellas County. So we are essentially an extension of the university based out of Gainesville, not to be confused with any other state college. It's our job to educate the public. So we teach all ages, not just college students. And as the Natural Resources Agent, I focus on environmental topics, one of my favorite of which is trees. So today we'll talk briefly about some tree ID basics. I have a whole webinar on this that we will share with you, but just as a little bit of a refresher for some things I'm going to go over later on. We'll talk about some of the common pine trees in Pinellas, oak trees, cypress trees, and then a couple others that are common. The way that I selected these trees is a while back, me and an intern traveled around to all the county parks and basically identified the top trees that are found throughout the county parks. And so that is how we came up with the trees we will feature today. So for those of you that might not be super familiar with the Zoom webinar, there should be a Q&A box on your screen, likely at the bottom of your screen. Please feel free to use that to ask questions and type them as you have them, and then we will address them at the end. You also have access to the chat box as well, but please don't use that if you have questions because it might get lost in there. So use the Q&A if you have a question related to today's presentation. You don't have to worry about your video or audio or anything like that in the webinar feature, so you can relax. Feel free to sit, stand, stretch, work out, whatever, while you're watching this. Again, I know I don't learn very well just sitting in front of a screen, so do what you need to do to get the most out of today's presentation. And this is being recorded and will be available on YouTube, and we will send that link to all of you when it's ready. Okay, so just to keep it interactive, are y'all ready? You can type in the chat. If I see that at least one person's ready, I'm going to jump on in. Oh, no one's ready. Okay, there's people. We're ready to learn. Here we go. Okay, so there's 41 characteristics that we're going to go through for tree ID basics. I'm just kidding. But really, there are all of these characteristics that you can look at when it comes to identifying trees. And so we don't have time to go into this today. So to simplify that, these are things to take note of when you're trying to identify a tree. First is habitat, and we'll be going over this today. Range, which I've already taken care of because it's common trees of Pinellas. So these are trees that are found naturally in this area. Bark is a unique feature when it comes to trees and something that's often overlooked, but very, very helpful for identification. Leaves, there's many characteristics that you can explore with leaves. I'll go over a few of those before we dive in. Even the twigs can be helpful for identification, flowers, fruits, and seeds. And so today we'll mostly be focusing on bark, leaf, and habitat. So just a quick either review or maybe new concept for some of you is in terms of leaves, there's what we call just leaf type. So leaves can either be what we call simple or compound. A simple leaf is one when it comes off of the twig or branch where you also see a bud. This is really important. And it comes off, there's just one leaf blade. A compound leaf is where it comes off the twig, there's a little bud, and instead of it just being one leaf blade, there's multiple. We call these leaflets, and this overall blade basically is considered a leaf. So this whole thing is a leaf, and then these individual ones are called leaflets. There's also all sorts of different leaf shapes, and we'll explore a lot of those today as well. So for example, needle-like leaves are a leaf shape. And I bet if I asked you guys in the chat, what's a tree that has needle-like leaves? We'll see if anyone might already know that. And believe it or not, that's like one step in the tree identification process. Lori's got it. Yes, pines. And we will be going over that as well. Another really important characteristic to pay attention to is what we call leaf arrangement. So these are all featuring simple leaves, right? It's branching off. There's just one leaf blade here. And if I was to connect where the buds come off or the overall leaf, this is alternate leaf arrangement, because you can see they're alternating up the leaf. It kind of makes like a zigzag pattern if I was to connect the dots here. This is the most common type of leaf arrangement you're going to see with pretty much all plants. What's less common is what we call opposite. So when, again, the leaf branches off, they're going to be parallel to each other along the twig. So if I was to connect these, right, it's just going to be these little parallel lines. They're directly opposite each other on the branch, so that makes sense. There's also whorled. We won't really get into that. It's also less common, but we will be featuring at least one species that has opposite leaf arrangement. And if you do see a tree that has opposite leaf arrangement, it narrows down your list of possible trees significantly. So very important to pay attention to. Even the veins within the leaf can be helpful for identification, things we probably never thought about. I'm not, again, going to get into details here, but just some things to pay attention to, as well as what we call leaf margins, or the edges of the leaf. So think of like margins of a piece of paper. So the edge of the leaf and what that looks like is also helpful for identifying trees or plants in general. Okay, so again, I could go on forever on that, and I did for like 45 minutes in this presentation that you can check out on demand at your leisure on our YouTube channel. Julia is going to post a link to that video if you want to go ahead and like bookmark that. So she'll push that out in the chat for you guys. All right, so now we're going to dive in. We're starting off with pines, which you can see featured behind me as well. Specifically, we're going to talk about the slash pine and longleaf pine. There's only 7 species of pine found in the state, and we have 3 that are vouchered here in Pinellas County. So one of the most common is slash pine. Again, we already identified pines have needle-like leaves. When it comes to slash pines, they are anywhere from 7 to 12 inches long. And one thing that's really important to pay attention to when it comes to pines is how many needles there are per bundle, or what we call fascicles. So these little clusters of needles is helpful, again, in identification. When it comes to slash pine, they come in either 2 or 3, and that's on the same tree. You can find both of these together, and you can kind of see that. I tried to get it a real picture, not just picking up dead needles, but you can see this bottom branch only has 2, and then the one right above it has 3 needles coming out. So in general, they're pretty stout and stiff needles compared to the other pine species. So I talked about bark being helpful as well. One thing to note when it comes to bark, though, is it changes significantly, sometimes more so with different species, from a young tree to a mature tree. So this is actually the bark. Both of these are bark of slash pine. The one on the left, this one here, is a young slash pine. So you can see it's this gray, there's some like reddish brown underneath, and it's very rough and furrowed, kind of these little valleys here. And then when it gets mature, it looks very different. You can see here on the right, it has these very orange-brown, large, flat plates. And so this is, the mature trees are a little bit easier to identify by bark than the young ones. In terms of habitat, slash pine and pines in general, we tend to think like higher and drier areas. Slash pines are actually more tolerant of wetter soils. So you'll actually find them on where there's poorly drained sandy soils, so along edges of ponds and swamps, and this is very much the case. I'm presenting here from Brooker Creek Preserve in Tarpon Springs, and kind of right at the edge of the floodplain, you'll start to see slash pines pop up, so they do like it a little bit wet. Now, when we look at longleaf pines, there's a few differences, and I'll highlight those on a separate slide as well, but they also have needle-like leaves. The name longleaf might give away that they have longer needles. So these range anywhere from 10 up to 18 inches long. There's a little bit of an overlap there. If you remember, slash pine can be as long as 12. Sometimes it's like a dead giveaway. You'll pick up one, it's like falling over, very long, and there's no other pine in this area that would have needles that long. Their bundles or fascicles of needles come in 3 and 4. 4s aren't quite as common. More commonly, you'll see 3. I tried to get a picture of that here, again, using ones that I collected at a local park. These tend to be a little bit more coarse in terms of texture, and a lot more flexible. And that also gives this kind of like ball-like appearance at the end of the branch. When you look up at a longleaf pine, their needles are so long and flexible, they kind of bend with gravity. And because they're so densely clustered at the end, it looks like a ball of needles, just the way that it falls. And you can see that kind of in this picture here. The slash pine, oops, sorry about that, tend to be a little bit more, again, stout and stiff, so they'll just kind of like stick out and not kind of have that folding over appearance. Again, in terms of bark, looks very different from young to mature. In general, I like to describe longleaf pine bark as more irregular, like the plates aren't as nice and neat as they are on the slash pine. It's a little bit more like flaky and scaly than the slash pine. So again, the coloration is pretty similar, and it can vary tree to tree, but in general, I just describe it as more peely and like irregular compared to slash pine. And then longleaf pines can tolerate moist soils, but tend to be found and prefer a little bit more drier habitat, higher and drier, and actually dominated much of the southeastern United States, I should say, prior to development and lots of other things that I won't get into today. So in terms of comparing and contrasting between slash and longleaf, it's not easy, I'll tell you that. Even professional foresters have a hard time telling them apart. Again, the number of needles per fascicle can be helpful. There is overlap with the 3s. The length, again, can be a giveaway. There is some overlap there. If you have the cones available, everything with longleaf pines are bigger, longer, larger, fatter than slash pine or really any other pine. So I included a picture of the cones here. You can see longleaf pines are significantly larger compared to slash. They're also a little bit more like dull brown. Slash pine is kind of this pretty chestnut, shiny brown. If you are looking at a tree during growing season, this is called the terminal bud, where the tree is growing taller. On longleaf pines, they have this really thick, silvery terminal bud. Some people call this a candle for obvious reasons. Slash pine does not, theirs don't look like this. I shouldn't say they don't have it. Obviously, they're growing as well. And then they have this weird growth stage when they're young where they just look like this ball of grass, whereas slash pine just look like a mini pine tree throughout their whole growth stage. So again, I go a lot more in depth on that. We have short videos in our This or That series. Julia will also post a link to that in the chat if you want to explore that more. And then we have one other pine species found here, which is the sand pine. It's not as common, so I'm not going to go into detail here, but just wanted to point out that that is the other pine species that we have. All right, so now we're switching gears to oaks, and we're going to explore the laurel oak and live oak, some of the more common species that we have here and can also be commonly confused. When it comes to laurel oaks, and we're looking at the leaves, they have what we call tardily deciduous leaves, where they're not losing their leaves when most of the other deciduous trees are. They tend to kind of hold on to them either through winter or just longer than, you'll see all the other trees losing their leaves, and they lose theirs a little bit later. Simple leaf, so it's just when it comes off the branch, right, there's just one leaf blade. They alternate along the twig. Their blades, this goes with really all oaks, can vary, but in general, they are kind of this elliptical shape, or lanceolate, they call it, shaped leaf, anywhere from 1 to 5 inches long and 1 to 2 inches wide. So again, can be variable depending on where it's growing. In general though, they are very smooth surface and shiny, especially when we're start to compare it with other species. Their bark, again, an important characteristic to pay attention to, tends to be this dark gray, sometimes almost black looking. It's much smoother when it's young. This is a mature oak on the right, and you can see there starts to get those little furrows that makes the bark somewhat rough, but not nearly as rough as live oaks, which we'll look at in a little bit. And they kind of have these flat ridges along the bark. Laurel oaks tend to, again, they can pretty much survive in most places, but they do like to be in a little bit moister soils. So along floodplains, anywhere there's a body of water that can, when it gets a lot of rain, the water can run off and keep the soils pretty moist. So along rivers and streams, and edges of swamps as well, which is definitely what you'll see here if you guys ever make your way to Brooker Creek Preserve. Live oaks, on the other hand, they have evergreen leaves. They don't have the tardily deciduous component that the laurel oaks do. Again, simple leaf structure. They alternate along the edge of the, or along the twig. The blades in general are much thicker than a laurel oak, about 1.5 inches wide. And you can see in the contrast here, the underside of the live oak leaf is significantly lighter than the top side. So there are tiny hairs that contribute to this coloration, but in general, if you just held a laurel oak leaf and a live oak leaf in your hand, the live oak leaf is going to be much stiffer and thicker than a laurel oak. And then you can see here the bark is significantly more rough and furrowed on the live oak. It has these very, very pronounced ridges. Sometimes it's very, very pronounced. So it's an important characteristic, again, to take note of. Live oaks, again, can be found on a variety of sites. They tend to like a little bit higher and drier, but can also tolerate kind of more moist areas near other water bodies, again, swamps, creeks, rivers, and things like that, where there's other deciduous trees mixed in. We again have another short video if you guys want to check it out and explore more on how to tell apart these two species. But in general, I talked about the thickness of the leaf, the bark being significantly rougher on the live oak compared to the laurel oak. And another thing on the live oak, they have what we call decumbent branching, which basically means they have this ability to kind of like their branches go down and then back up, which is why they were historically used for shipbuilding, just to find that right curvature. Laurel oaks tend to be a lot more straight in the way that they grow. So just overall structure as well can be helpful. There's one other oak species that's very common throughout Pinellas County, and that is the water oak. Water oaks are another one that's tardily deciduous. So they'll kind of start to lose their leaves now or in a couple months. Simple leaf structure, alternate, again, leaf arrangement. Water oaks are by far known for having the most variability in their leaf shape. It's important always when we're trying to identify trees to look at more than one leaf or more than one part of any structure that we're trying to identify or take note of for characteristics. The leaves are overall pretty thin, anywhere from 4 inches long to 2 inches wide. But the key with water oaks is they have spatulate-shaped leaves. So the name from, think of like a spatula, it gets much wider at the tip of the leaf compared to the base. So it's broader at the top. Now, I know, it's not my fault, as James always says. All of these leaves that you see here on the top right of your screen are all from the same water oak. I know. But one thing you will note is it is on all of them, it's broader again at the tip of the leaf than it is at the base. So again, important to always look at multiple leaves when trying to identify. Sometimes again, they will have this lobed appearance, especially on younger trees. They are bristle tipped. So if you look at the very tips of the leaves, there is a tiny little bristle that can be helpful for identification. In general, the leaf is very smooth. They kind of have this dull green underside. And, the common terminology we would say is, they have these tufts of hair and the axils of the veins. Y'all ain't gonna remember that, but you are gonna remember that they have hairy armpits, which is what we like to say when we are teaching folks when we used to have classes in person. So if you have a water oak leaf and you flip it over and look at where the veins kind of meet this mid vein that runs through the center of the leaf, there's these tiny little tufts of hair, and we not scientifically refer to those as hairy armpits, which people are much more likely to remember. So that's a key characteristic for identification. Their bark, also, if you kind of remember the 3 that we've looked at, is different from the other 2. In general, it's kind of smooth and gray on younger trees, and again, it becomes a little bit more rough and furrowed on older trunks. And you can see it's kind of more of like a blocky furrowing than the long ridges that we saw on the other species. And not quite as rough as live oak, and maybe a little bit rougher than laurel oak. Once you start to really hone in on the bark, you'll start to pick up on these cues a lot easier. And water oak, hence the name, tend to like the soils a little bit wetter soils, floodplain areas, mixed forests, so mixed in with a variety of species, and but they are tolerable of higher and drier wetlands or uplands as well. Okay, something that's not tolerant of higher and drier uplands are cypress trees. So now we're going to check out our 2 cypress species that we have here in Pinellas County. First up is bald cypress, which is probably what most people are familiar with, or at least that name of bald cypress. We might not even know that there was 2 different cypress species. So they again have needle-like leaves, despite what they look like. That is how they are defined. They have alternate leaf arrangement, and they are deciduous, hence the name bald. Their leaves, although they are needle-like, have this kind of spreading appearance to them. They almost look like a feather if you were to describe them. So if you were to take a bald cypress needle and lay it on the ground, it's flat. These come off directly across from each other. This overall this on this image, this overall area, this whole thing is the leaf. In terms of habitat, so cypress in general like really wet habitats. They tend to prefer areas where there's moving water. So rivers and stream banks are more common where you're going to find bald cypress versus pond cypress, which we'll talk about in just a second, and often in association with water tupelo, which is another species we won't be talking about today because they are not super common, but just something to take note of. And then on the other hand, we have pond cypress, and you can see if you look at their leaf, instead of having that kind of feather-like appearance, it's more needle-like, if you will. So these are it's this ascendens specific epithet or part of the scientific name. You can see they kind of like grow in this upward ascending pattern. They're flattened to this kind of mid part of the leaf. So it's a very different look compared to the bald cypress. They are also deciduous. The main way to tell these two apart is just by looking at the leaf. Habitat can also be helpful. They do overlap, but in general, pond cypress tend to like more stagnant waters. So think shallow ponds, kind of wet depressions, just where it might be wet part of the year and dry others. Occasionally, you can also find them along stream margins as well. So again, I kind of already went over this, but in general, pond cypress are different just by their leaves that curl upwards. They're actually spirally arranged along the twig. So if you were to take a closer look at this, these leaves come off in a spiral arrangement as they go up the twig, which the bald cypress does not have that. You can't tell the two apart by the bark, but I did include a picture of the bark here just in case you guys were curious. They kind of have this shredding bark. It's very orange underneath, which you can see here, and tends to be like a lighter gray on the outer portion. Okay, if you're working out, take a water break. If you're doing squats, take a look away from the screen. Just want to give you guys a quick second to not be looking at the screen, stand up, twirl around, do a dance. I'll give you 2 minutes, give myself to get some water, and we'll come back and finish up with 3 more tree species. So I'll set, let's see. Let's just say 10:30, so 3 minutes to, you can even run to the potty if you needed to. So 10:30, I will come back and finish. All right, there's still some time, but I'll put my voice on your computer to bring you all back, and I'll start as soon as my clock turns to 10:30. And look, nobody left me. You're welcome for your break. I think we actually gained a couple participants during break. So again, if you guys have any questions, feel free to use that Q&A feature on your screen. And I see it's 10:30, so I'm gonna keep on cranking through. So the next 3 species that we are going to explore is the Pignut Hickory, red maple, and southern magnolia. And we're gonna start off with Pignut Hickory. So the Pignut Hickory this is the first one that we've featured that has a compound leaf. So when the leaf comes off of the twig, there's the bud, and then this little portion, kind of the leaf stalk, is what we call the petiole. Once it branches off there, then there's these tiny, well, not tiny in the case of Pignut, but there are leaflets. So you can see here, this would be the twig up here, and this overall part here is the leaf. And then these are considered leaflets. So that's what makes a compound leaf. They are deciduous. They have alternate leaf arrangement. So this overall leaf, again, will be alternating along the twig. In general, the number of leaflets is helpful for identification purposes for certain tree species. So in the case of Pignut Hickory, there's usually between 5 to 7 leaflets. Also, depending, some will say, you know, it has this leaflet like at the end here is helpful. Sometimes it'll be lacking, so it's like an even number. Sometimes it tends to be odd where there's this one right at the kind of like terminal point of the leaf. They can range in size from 3 to 6 inches long, and they are very shiny, especially in the fall. You can kind of see that in the bottom picture here, and this is the fruit of the Pignut Hickory. Their bark is also very, very unique in, especially on mature trees. So it's, again, tends to be smooth on younger tree species, but it creates these really deep fissures on mature trees. And you can kind of see it here. It's sometimes more distinct on certain trees than others of the Pignut Hickory, but in general, it creates this like diamond-shaped pattern. So that's something to look for with the Pignut Hickory. You can kind of make it out here, how it's, maybe you can imagine that there's a diamond pattern throughout, but it is obvious. Sometimes it's a little bit easier if you're not so close or zoomed in on the bark. In terms of habitat, they tend to like upland areas. They can tolerate some moisture, but in general, it's not going to be a habitat that's totally dominated by pignuts. They are often mixed in with other tree species, most commonly with other oak species. And I did not include a picture of the inside of a pignut. I just thought about this now, but when you find them, after they've fallen off the tree, they often will split open. And when you look at the inside, it looks like a pig's nose, and that is how we were taught to learn and remember with the Pignut Hickory. So that's a fun thing if you guys have kids or grandkids, to find one and hold it up to your nose and pretend you're a pig. So there's your fun activity you can do this afternoon. Okay, so red maple. Red maples are another tree species that's deciduous. So this is a great time to be teaching a program, right? I'm telling you all about the leaves that you can go out and not find right now. Yeah. When I took my dendrology course in college, which is the study of forest plants, we learned all of our tree species, 150 of them, when they all had leaves on them. And guess when our final exam was? Yeah, in the fall. So that's why the bark and other characteristics are important to note as well. So we're back to simple leaf structure, or leaf type is simple, so it comes off the branch, there's just one leaf. But this is our first one with opposite leaf arrangement. So when the leaves come off the twig, they're going to be directly across from each other. And I'll give you a little tip on that in just a second. They can be pretty variable. You can see almost some of that variability in these two pictures that you see here, not just in color, but in terms of the leaf shape. They tend to have anywhere from 3 to 5 lobes. If you look carefully here, these are lobed portions of the leaf. They have serrated leaf margins, but they call it irregularly serrate because they're not like a distinct pattern of kind of like toothing along the edge of the leaf. It's irregular. They have this greener upper surface, but a very like almost silvery pale green underside, which when the wind blows is a very distinct feature of the red maple. They do turn beautiful colors in the fall before they lose their leaves, and they have, again, if you remember this part of the leaf stalk, or what we call the petiole, is reddish, becoming really red in the fall before they fall off the tree. So that's another helpful identification feature. Now, I mentioned before, if you find a tree that has opposite leaf arrangement, you have significantly narrowed down your possible options of tree species. So there is a little trick. There's different variations of this. I'm keeping it simple for today's presentation. If you can just remember MAD, M-A-D. So maples, we mostly just have the red maple here, but if you go further in North Florida and other parts of the country, they have other maple species. Ashes, we do have a couple ash species, green ash, probably the most common one here. And then dogwoods, often people think of flowering dogwood. We're a little too far south for flowering dogwood, but we do have swamp dogwood here. So any of these species have opposite leaf arrangement. There's a few others that don't quite fit into this pretty MAD formula, but in general, it's helpful. So if you see opposite leaf arrangement, you can narrow it down: maple, ash, or dogwood. In terms of red maple bark, Julia found this awesome picture actually yesterday when we were out on our hike. So this shows the variation in the bark from a young maple that was growing right next to a mature maple. So you can see the bark is much smoother when they're young, this light gray, becoming a little bit darker gray, and very shallow fissures. So it becomes a rough bark, but it's not very deep like we saw with, say, like the live oak. And in general, we probably find red maples in wetter areas. They tend to like lower moisture soils, but they can also tolerate drier upland sites. More often, again, we'll find them where the soils are a little bit wet. All right, and then southern magnolia. So this is a fun, different tree. There's not really many other trees that you could confuse this with here in Pinellas County. They have evergreen leaves, so they retain their broad green leaves year-round. Simple leaf type, so if the branch was here, comes off, again, there's just one leaf blade, alternates along the branch. These leaves are super thick and leathery. I mean, it is a very sturdy leaf. Tend to be pretty, let's just say, the leaves don't vary that much. They usually are found in this elliptical shape, and very distinct differences between the top side of the leaf and the underside of the leaf. We often will see it with this very kind of rusty color underside. That's not always the case. Sometimes it can just be a greenish color. But these are covered in tons of tiny, tiny, tiny hairs that give it that coloration. And they can range in size from 6 to 12 inches long. Their bark, again, will change from young to mature, but again, smooth when young. This is kind of almost in between, I would say. They will, again, get these kind of scaly flat plates as they get mature. Can't really see much evidence of that here. This is probably more similar to what you'd see on a younger tree species, but you can see it's very different from some of the other tree bark that we have seen in today's presentation. And in general, southern magnolias naturally, there's a lot of planted southern magnolia, but naturally will be found in swamp habitats or areas like wet areas near basically any form of salt water. So that was the quick run through of, I think I went through 10 different common tree species in Pinellas County. We obviously have a lot more. That's just a quick introduction to hopefully pique your interest and help you be able to identify some trees that you see when you're out and about. We do have a lot more featured throughout tons of resources that we have, one of which I'd be remiss if I didn't plug, is our This or That field guide. Not only does it go through different plant species, tree species, but also commonly confused animal species as well. So this is available if you are interested. Julia just pushed that out in the chat. I call it my tree Bible, is the native trees of the Southeast, which I know is hard to see. There we go. With the virtual background, you can see I have lots of tabs in here. So they were nice enough to let me use those drawings of the different leaf structures. So that was credited to Timber Press. There's a great resource through the School of Forestry Resources and Conservation at the university as well, where you can learn about all the different trees of Florida. And I provided appropriate credit for photos unless they were taken by me. So this is like just one of many things that we're going to do to celebrate Florida Arbor Day. You can check out our Google site, which Julia will push out in the chat for a lot more. We have some fun scavenger hunts and interactive games for the family. There's several upcoming classes that Extension's offering, a Waterwise workshop, invasive plants, and then James will be doing the life of a dead tree at the end of the month. And you can stay tuned to either Brooker's Facebook or Pinellas County Extension's Facebook or both for all of these opportunities and more. And before we get into Q&A, Julia's going to launch a quick poll that'll pop up on your screen, ask you a couple quick questions, and then Julia will lead me in a Q&A session.
Okay, we'll leave this poll up for another 10 seconds and then we'll pull it down and get into Q&A. If you've got any questions, now is the time to put them in the Q&A box.
And if any of you have to run, before you leave, I just want to thank you guys for coming, but I am happy to stick around and we'll do Q&A, and if it even runs past 11, I'm happy to answer any additional questions, but appreciate you guys coming and filling out the quick poll.
Okay, that's most of you. We are going to end the polling now and jump into Q&A. Okay, so let's see here, Lara. Our first question is, do you see the wing elm tree a great deal in our parks? And do you know if they're good for planting in your yard?
So I'm a North County person, so I guess I can't really say for South County for sure. I honestly don't see a ton of winged elm in the area, and I don't know if, James, you're still on here, if you have additional input that you want to provide for that. In terms of do they make a good tree for one's yard, I would say it really depends. There's so many factors to consider when it comes to planting trees, and like what soils you have and what you're really looking for. So I couldn't really accurately answer that question without knowing like what you want, like a shade tree or a food tree for wildlife. So I'd have to say to be determined, and I'm happy to, if you want to send me an email, we can explore that further.
Okay, thank you. And someone did ask about if they can bookmark all of the links we provided in the chat. So we'll send a follow-up email to everyone and make sure you get all of those links again as well. And then Lara, is why is Chinese tallow considered a pest tree?
So Chinese tallow, it is a beautiful tree, especially this time of year. We have a few that creep up in Brooker Creek Preserve, and it's classified as an invasive species, and it tends to take over natural areas. It's not native to Pinellas County or the state of Florida. Our go-to resource and recommendation for finding out those answers, the university does research. It's available, oh my gosh, I was gonna say, I almost blanked. It's the IFAS assessment. I don't know, Julia, if you can maybe quickly search for the UF IFAS assessment of for invasive plants, and we can include that link. It's a super user-friendly resource. You can type in the common name or scientific name, and it gives you kind of the recommendation of either why you can plant it or why you can't, and additional resources for that. So.
Okay, just put it in the chat, thank you. Okay, next question. Are any of the maples considered non-native? Are community planted red maples that were purchased from Home Depot?
I am not aware of any non-native maples, so at least not that's like an issue in this area. I'm sure you can purchase, you know, ornamental maples, but if you got a red maple from Home Depot, it's probably fine, and I've never heard of that being an issue.
Wonderful. And the Pignut Hickory, what color are the leaves when they fall?
Good question. They tend to just kind of turn like a yellowish green, sometimes yellow to brown. They don't really get the reddish coloration that we think of with fall colors. I have a ton where I live, and so yeah, I typically see like a yellowish brown before they fall.
Thank you. And we have another question. Someone has a very curvy looking pine tree in their yard. Are any of the species curvier than others? I wonder which kind it is.
And you said, did you say pine?
Or, pine looking.
Pine looking, oh boy.
And you're welcome to send us a picture as well, right? And we can ID.
Yeah, I would say I don't even want to attempt to give any guesses without having a look. And it could just depend sometimes. I mean, we have some crazy curvy pine looking, well, pines here. It was just, you know, something happened during when it was growing and maturing that caused it to look that way, but I'm happy to look at an image if you want to send me an email.
Wonderful. And someone asked if there is a field walk regarding this subject, and we are going to record a virtual tree tour that we will push out later this month, but we are not currently doing in-person guided hikes or walks at this time.
Yeah, and we kind of have, so set up here at Brooker Creek Preserve, I do have what we're calling the traveling tree walk setup that does identify trees along the Education Center trail. And Julia set up what we call a tree quest. That's kind of a scavenger hunt form for you to identify trees as you walk along the trails here. So at Brooker Creek Preserve, yes, there are some options, and yeah, we're looking forward to creating more opportunities for you guys.
Wonderful. And Lara, do you know of any endangered tree species in Pinellas County?
Oh, that's a great question. No, I don't. I do not know that. That will be my fun homework assignment.
Wonderful. And do you offer a similar presentation to this on palm trees?
I wish I could do that for you. There's only a few native palms, and I was only trained in native species, so that's definitely something I could inquire with our urban horticulture agent. She might be better able to do that. We do in that field guide address some palm species, but yeah, to be determined. It's a good idea.
And is the camphor tree invasive, and does wildlife use it?
So yes, the camphor tree is invasive, and again, if you use that IFAS assessment tool, it'll indicate such. Unfortunately, most wildlife have or will take advantage of the resources, whether it's, you know, the sap or the fruit provided by invasive trees, which is why they continue to grow and spread. So yeah, wildlife will take advantage of these. Same with like Brazilian pepper. Lots of birds will eat those berries. So yeah, wildlife will use them.
Thank you. And can you talk a little bit about cypress knees? Do they become trees?
That's a great question. The knees do not become trees. There's different theories out there on the purpose that they serve, whether it's for gas exchange because they tend to grow in areas where oxygen lacks because they're underwater, and it's just the soils that are there. There's a theory that they're used to for competition to keep out other trees from growing because they're sending up kind of all these like barriers. There's also a theory that they're used for stabilization because they're in wet soils. So I tend to like the competition theory personally, but to answer the question, they do not grow into trees.
Thank you. And does gumbo limbo grow here in Pinellas County?
It can. It is not naturally found here. So we're outside of its natural range, I guess, to answer that question.
And let's see here. We've got a couple more questions. Can you talk a little about mangrove tree types?
Yeah, so, and we are this or that field guide. I do actually also have a blog, and maybe we can include that in the follow-up email that talks about the different mangrove species. There's red, black, and white mangroves. Generally speaking, red mangroves are found closest to the water, the edge of the water. Black mangroves would be like the next interior species, and then white mangroves tend to be even more interior than that. I don't know like how in depth to get here, but in general, I would say like white mangroves have the most like tree-like structure, whereas the red mangroves look more shrubby. You wouldn't look at it and be like, that's a tree. But they're the ones that have the long curving roots and those long propagules to grow new plants. So I could go on and on, but without pictures and things, I don't know that I'd be doing you much justice, but there are 3 different species found here.
Great, thank you. And then the bald and pond cypress, do they both have knees? And do you want to mention any other trees that may have knees as well?
Yes, you guys are asking such good questions. So yes, pond cypress and bald cypress both have knees. Good question. The tupelo trees are also they're referred to as knees, but they don't really look the same as cypress knees. They tend to look almost like branches like coming out of the water. They're these much larger kind of curved structures. So those are the only ones that I'm aware of that have knee-like structures. I guess I would say, speaking of mangroves, the black mangroves have these structures that they send out of the soil as well. They're not really knees, but another thing that just like sticks out of the soil that's part of the plant.
Thank you. And someone did just let us know that the Pinellas chapter of the Florida Native Plant Society does have a presentation on mangroves that can be found on their Facebook page if anyone wants to check that out.
There you go. Awesome.
Yeah, thank you. And Lara, do oaks serve as a host for epiphytes?
Oh, yes. Yeah, great question. Yeah. I mean, generally speaking, epiphytes are just another plant growing on a plant. And yeah, especially because there's so many varieties and different species of oaks, it depends. Some with the more rough bark can really capture a lot of nutrients that epiphytes would want to take advantage of. Some prefer the smoother bark because they can easier have kind of root on a little bit easier. So yeah, in general, for sure.
Wonderful, thank you. And someone asked how they can sign up for invasive plants, so I'm just getting that link for them. Let's see if we've got any more questions. Someone has laurel looking trees popping up over their yard. Is there a good way to ID them? I'm guessing when they're very young like that.
Yeah, it's definitely hard. I'm happy to, again, if you want to send pictures. It is also helpful, especially if you have a lot of them popping up. Usually that's because you have a mature oak somewhere around. So if that is the case, identifying the mature oak that's in your yard will likely tell you what is growing up beneath you. So if you have a mature laurel oak in your yard that's dropping a bunch of acorns, which it likely is, then that is likely probably what species it is. I'm not saying it's probably a laurel oak, but depending what mature oak you have in your yard.
Okay. Wonderful, thank you. And someone did let us know that there are gumbo limbo at Fort DeSoto, near the ranger's home there. And I think that wraps up all of our questions for this presentation. Yep.
Right. Well, thank you guys for sticking around through Q&A. I like to steal our volunteers who we miss dearly at the preserve since we're still closed at the education center. The preserve's open, the education center's closed, but they would always say, no offense, but take a hike. So I encourage you guys to check out a local park or just around your neighborhood and see what trees you can identify. Yeah, and thanks for tuning in. Have a good day and happy Arbor Day.
Happy Arbor Day, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us. And thank you, Lara. Have a great weekend, everyone. Bye.